Oh, okay, fair enough. Alright, well, I guess I can do this. Welcome back, guys. Um, yo, Drew! Yo! You Gopnik. You Gopnik goes conservatives be like there's a sinister cabal of the ultra rich that are eating babies. Anyways, I also believe we should tax them less. Fucking true. True. I love it. Alright, so we are back. What the fuck? Oh, shit, Alright, so we're gonna start off with fuck. We're gonna check off Marxism today. It used to be Marxist Paul, if I'm not mistaken. Um, but yeah, we're back on Socialism 101. This is the second video. It's called "What is the mode of production?" What is a mode of production? And
We did.
I are in my opinion, well, not even an opinion. I'm just gonna say TLDR. It's literally a way we organize the economy.
Didn't have to
But
spend all
we're gonna let Marxism today explain that a little bit better than me, because
our time working
you
for
know.
bosses who really just don't give a shit about us beyond our ability to produce profits for them. If we could instead spend our time doing things that actually matter to us. If, in other words, we lived under communism. Well, that's the dream, and we will get there sooner or later. But socialism isn't just gonna happen because we think it's this nice, fanciful idea. Rather, socialism is going to happen because there are conflicts within the capitalist mode of production itself that necessitate a progression beyond its limitations. But what is this internal conflict that necessitates socialism? Well, if we want to understand that, we need to first ask, what is a mode of production? Today we're going to take a look at the answer to this question, which will undoubtedly reveal why communism is truly inevitable. Welcome back to Socialism 101, a series designed to help educate people with no prior knowledge on the basics of socialism and communism from an explicitly Marxist-Leninist and Marxist-Leninist Maoist perspective, with short and hopefully easily
We're also going to do some
videos.
Winter Todd, by the way.
If this sounds interesting to you, then go ahead and hit subscribe
Once
and turn on the notification bell.
my friend gets online.
Now, we often hear the term capitalist mode of production, and we may think that this is just a synonym for capitalism, a fancier way of saying it. But if we prod and poke this term just a little bit more, we'll see that it in and of itself reveals the unsustainable nature of this system. So, let's do exactly that. Get the notepads ready. At its most basic form, mode of production simply means the way things are produced, such as the necessities of life like food, housing, clothing, medical equipment, Nintendo, etc. Modes of production within any given society are comprised of two key aspects. One, the productive forces, and two, the relations of production. Have you written that down? No? You're going to regret that later. The first key aspect of the mode of production, the productive forces, is comprised of labour power and the means of production. Now, labour power is not just work, but rather the capacity or the ability to do work. To better understand this, think about the time when you're at work versus the time when you're actually doing work. If you work for an hourly wage, then you're selling your labour power to your boss. Every hour you're selling your capacity to do work. It usually doesn't matter whether you work harder or you do less actual work, you're likely still going to get the same hourly wage. This is because you're not selling your labor directly, you're selling your labor power, which, when you check the notes that you're definitely taking down, you'll remember is your capacity or ability to do work. And this causes a conflict between you and your boss because you're going to want to do as little work as possible, making it a better deal for you, while they're going to want you to do as much work as possible within that time frame, making it a better and more profitable deal for them. Now, the means of production refers to everything that's required in order to produce, including instruments of production, like the tools, machinery, and buildings in which we carry out our work, as well as subjects of production, which includes natural materials like iron ore, and also materials that have been filtered through previous labour, like that iron ore in its extracted form, which we call raw materials. So when you hear extremely based people saying seize the means of production, that's a call for workers to take control of all that good stuff. The tools, the factories, the raw materials, etc. And to use them for the common good, rather than to further line the pockets of wealthy private capitalists who do none of the actual work. You still with me? I know there was a lot of terminology there and I know it got maybe a little bit complex, but the good news is that it's all going to be worth it in the end and we're already over the worst of it. So you can basically relax now. Okay, so now that we've talked a little bit about the productive forces, let's take a look at the second key aspect of modes of production, relations of production. We can easily understand this by simply asking, how do we relate to the process of production? Are we workers in a business generating profit for someone else? Or are we the owners of that business who do little more than simply hoover up the profits that are generated by workers? Under the capitalist mode of production, the relations of production separate society primarily into two classes: based workers, the proletariat, and cringe capitalists, the bourgeoisie. We either relate to production as workers or we relate to production as owners.
Cringe
Owners of the means of
capitalists.
production. Now, there are
Based
various
workers.
subclasses or
True.
strata among these two groups, as well as some other classes that we can get into in a later video dedicated specifically to class. But for now, we'll focus on the two main classes of capitalism, the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. Rather than being a system that benefits everybody equally, the relations of production that we see in capitalism are set up so as to primarily benefit the capitalist to the detriment of the worker. Make no mistake, the capitalist's gain is the worker's loss. The profit they're making is the wealth that you're creating. Never forget that. Now, we'll talk more about the exact process through which the exploitation of labour takes place in a later video specifically about the labour theory of value. But it should already be starting to become clear that there's a definite conflict between the productive forces on one hand and the relations of production on the other, between the interests of labour and the interest of capital, between the working class proletariat and the capitalist bourgeoisie. This conflict must be resolved. It's not going away. And in fact, we see that this conflict is actually intensifying as technology develops. With automation, countless jobs are going to disappear. The development of the productive forces will make the current relations of production upon which capitalism relies completely untenable, with wealth and resources concentrating into fewer and fewer capitalist hands, leaving us, the masses, out of work and unable to access life's necessities. And as nobody will have any money, this in turn is going to mean that the capitalists won't be able to sell their products to anyone. So now we're beginning to see how unstable and ultimately self-destructive this system is. And we're just scratching the surface. We're going to talk a lot more about how capitalism sows the seeds of its own destruction in upcoming videos. But don't worry, it's not all doom and gloom. We'll also talk about how we can solve these problems. I'll give you a hint. Class struggle. Lots and lots of class struggle. Today we've looked at the meaning of mode of production, including its two key components, the productive forces and the relations of production. We've looked at how labour power and the means of production constitute the productive forces, and the way in which the based workers and the cringe capitalists embody the relations of production under capitalism. Most importantly, we've looked at how the conflict between productive forces and relations of production forms the economic basis for social revolution, inevitably propelling us from capitalism and into socialism, making our apparently utopian dreams into a concrete material reality. Next time, the difference between personal property and private property. Get those toothbrushes ready. Thank you for watching this video. Hopefully you found it useful in some way or another. If you're able to support this work, please consider
Communism is
donating
when
€1 or $1 per month
you
over
get
on
to use
Patreon
your
or a
toothbrush.
once-off donation over on
Sorry,
Ko-fi.
you don't get a
Links in the
personal
description box
toothbrush.
below. Thank you to Rare Hero, Cormac O'Brien, Dan Hunter, Red Corridor Raya, Christian Napales, Comrade Romano, Jason, Michaela Schmid, Marius Hex, Ryan Hodgson, Don.
This is not just a deck of cards. This is a collection of 54
Now, I can't actually see you given that this is YouTube and all. So you could be wearing a tuxedo or you could be wearing nothing at all. Stupid sexy Flanders. But bear with me on this one so we can play out this scenario. I'm going to assume that you, my very attractive friend, are wearing a hat. But not just any hat. The most beautiful hat I've ever seen. Naturally, I'm extremely jealous and want one of my own. Nice hat, I tell you. How much are you going to sell it to me for? To which you respond, very reasonably like a normal person would. Feck off, Paul. This is my personal property. I'm not selling this.
Feck off,
this hat
Paul.
is to be used,
I
not
love it.
exchanged.
Feck
Take
off.
that commodity trade nonsense elsewhere. As you can imagine, I'm understandably heartbroken at having been shut down like that, and I run home with my tail between my legs. All dreams of ever owning such a beautiful hat like that myself, having been crushed by your cruel, cruel words. But on the way back, I pass by a shop and I see that very same beautiful hat in the window. Excited, I run inside and I pick it up. But the shop owner's alarmed and sternly warns me, "Put that hat down, it's the company's private property. If you want it, you're gonna have to pay for it."
That makes
Now, naturally, I'm baffled. I was assured that this beautiful hat was personal property that was meant to be used. Now I'm being told that it's private property, that if I want access to its warm embrace, then I'm gonna have to exchange money for it. How can it be that the purpose of this beautiful hat for you is use, while for the shop owner its purpose is exchange? That it can be either personal property or private property depending on who owns it and what they're doing with it. Well, let's get to the bottom of this.
Let's go.
Welcome to Socialism 101, a series designed to help educate people with no prior knowledge on the basics of socialism and communism from an explicitly Marxist-Leninist and Marxist-Leninist-Maoist perspective, with short and hopefully easily digestible videos. If this sounds interesting to you, then go ahead and hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell below. So, we've run into a little bit of difficulty here. This beautiful hat seems to be both personal property and private property. It has use value in its usefulness as it protects your head against the cruelty of the wind and the rain, but it also has exchange value in that it can be exchanged for a certain price on the market. Well, in fact, this is one of the most basic building blocks of the capitalist system, the commodity. And the key feature of commodities is that they possess both use value and exchange value. They can be both personal property and private property. However, they're produced primarily for exchange as private property to make profits for capitalists, and secondarily produced for use to become personal property. This goes for all commodities produced under the capitalist mode of production, from food to clothes to, you guessed it, Nintendo. If you look at the place you're living right now, whether that's an apartment, a house, or anything else, for you this has use value or usefulness. For you, it's shelter. It keeps you warm, protected. You get to relax with friends and family, get drunk, talk socialism, etc. But your home likely wasn't created primarily for that purpose. It was created primarily to be the private property of the bourgeoisie that would be exchanged and make them more money. Okay, so now we can see that there's a fundamental difference emerging between how the working class proletariat engages with personal property, your home as a place to live, and how the capitalist bourgeoisie engages with private property, that home they acquired solely to make profit. In fact, let's take a moment to clearly map out these differences. In the last video, we talked a little bit about labour power. Now this is also a commodity in that it possesses both use value in its ability to produce, as well as exchange value as capitalists purchase it from us for a certain price in the forms of wages and salaries. For most working class people, we sell our labour power, or commodity, C, to bosses. In return for this, our bosses give us a little bit of money, M. We then take this money that we receive from our wage or salary and use that to purchase commodities, C, for us to use, like food, clothes, toothbrushes, etc. This is the CMC circuit that the working class engages in. We have our commodity, labour power, that we sell for money, and with that money we purchase more commodities. CMC. Capitalists, on the other hand, operate not just on a CMC circuit, but on an inverted MCM circuit. The capitalist circuit begins with money, M, which they use to purchase commodities, C, primarily labour power, in order to get back more money, M. And importantly, that final M includes the initial sum of money invested plus profit that has been generated through labour power. We can signify the presence of this added profit with M prime. Capitalists can then take this profit and use it to purchase more commodities, to get even more profit, to purchase even more commodities, and so on and so on. Okay, take a moment to give yourself an L pat on the back because you've just learned the general formula of capital, MCM. Now, this is the simplified version of the capitalist circuit. There are a few more steps in between that we'll return to in a later video. But we can already see from this that the proletariat on the CMC circuit and the bourgeoisie on the MCM circuit interact quite differently with property. The proletariat acquires personal property exclusively for us to use. The bourgeoisie acquires private property for exchange in order to make profits. Communists seek to abolish private property, not personal property. We seek to abolish exchange value and instead produce entirely for use. To, as the old saying goes, abolish the commodity form. Now, onto the ever-pressing question of toothbrushes. Yes, you get to keep your feckin' toothbrush for personal use.
Damn.
But if there are capitalists who are producing them for profit, for exchange, then you better believe that we're going to hunt them down and redistribute those toothbrushes for the good of the people. The
Yeah.
people's toothbrushes.
The people's
Today we've
toothbrushes.
looked at
Let's
the differences
fucking
between
go.
personal property and private property. As a general rule, personal property is that property that we possess in order to use. Use value. Private property, on the other hand, is property that's possessed for the purpose of making profits. Exchange value. We've also mapped out the ways in which workers and capitalists relate to commodities, either on the proletarian CMC circuit or the bourgeois MCM circuit, which is the general formula of capital. Next up, that burning question of our time, what is capitalism? Thank you for watching this video. Hopefully you found it useful in one way or another. For more on housing and the question of use value and exchange value, I strongly recommend checking out the second episode of Space Baby's Marx in the House series, from which I borrow quite heavily in this video. Link in the description box below. If you're able to support this work, then please consider donating €1 or $1 per month over on Patreon, or a once-off donation over on Ko-fi. Thank you to Rare Hero, Cormac O'Brien, Dan Hunter, Red Corridor Raya, Christian Napales, Comrade Romano, Jason, Michaela Schmid, Mamarius Hex, Ryan Hodgson, Don Loquistla, Gabriel Bailey, Lepanian, Hugh Jass, The Rhineway Condition, Jess, Ian McShay, Libertarian Stalinist, Soup, Pontus, Colin Walsh, Hagen Mitchells, Evan Crossland, Borku Gorilla, Roja, and Daniel Hamilton. I wouldn't be able to make these videos without yous, and I certainly wouldn't be able to pay my bills. Cheers everyone, agus slán go fóill.
This is an opinion you can trust. From Rhonda Schwab, the owner of a BBB-accredited
Shut
kind of
up.
shop. Rhonda can...
Oh wait, hold on. No, I had to go. What is capital?
What is capitalism? Easy. Capitalism is freedom and democracy. Unless we try to use that freedom and democracy to vote in a people-centered government that challenges capitalism in any way. Like in Chile in 1973, when Salvador Allende, the democratically elected socialist president, was ousted from office and replaced by the fascist Augusto Pinochet in a CIA-backed coup. But don't get me wrong, capitalism is freedom and democracy for some people, just not us. Democracy for an insignificant minority. Democracy for the rich. That is the democracy of capitalist society. Normal working people don't get a say on how our workplaces are run, the places where we spend most of our waking lives. We don't get a say in what homes are built where and who gets to live in them. In fact, we don't get a meaningful say in the day-to-day runnings of our societies at all. The only thing we do get is the opportunity to choose a representative of the ruling class once every 4 or 5 years to administer capitalist rule. And if we attempt to venture outside those narrow confines, then you better believe it'll be time for the international capitalist class to mount a CIA-backed coup to bring us even more freedom and democracy. So, let's be honest. Capitalism? Not all it's cracked up to be. Now, what the feck is it? Well, let's find out. Welcome to Socialism 101, a series designed to help educate people with no prior knowledge on the basics of socialism and communism from an explicitly Marxist-Leninist and Marxist-Leninist-Maoist perspective, with short and hopefully easily digestible videos. If this sounds interesting to you, then go ahead and hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell below. Now, so far in this series, we've learned that capitalism is a stage of historical development between feudalism and socialism. We've also talked a bit about capitalism's relations of production. Workers sell their labour power through wage labour, and capitalists purchase this in order to make more profits. From this, we can build a basic understanding of capitalism. Capitalism is a system of private ownership of the means of production for the purpose of extracting profits or surplus value produced by wage labourers. Now, how did we get here? Well, our old friend Karl Marx said that this system becomes inevitable from the moment there is a free sale by the labourer himself of labour power as a commodity. But it is also only from then onwards that commodity production is generalised and becomes the typical form of production. It is only from then onwards that, from the first, every product is produced for sale and all wealth produced goes through the sphere of circulation. Now, under earlier systems like feudalism, there was also a limited amount of simple commodity production. Like if you grew some food for yourself but you weren't able to eat it all, so you sold the leftovers. But this production under earlier systems was generally for use. Capitalism developed out of feudalism as commodity production started small, but then grew with the rise of the bourgeoisie and became generalised as the typical form of production. To the extent that commodity production, in accordance with its own inherent laws, develops further into capitalist production, the property laws of commodity production change into the laws of capitalist appropriation. As we see this transition from feudalism to capitalism, we also see massive legal changes in society that allow for the free trade of both the means of production and labour power, which itself now becomes a commodity. The capitalist epoch is characterised by the fact that labour power, in the eyes of the worker himself, takes on the form of a commodity which is his property. His labour consequently takes on the form of wage labour. It is only from this moment that the commodity form of the products of labour becomes universal. So when you've got private ownership of the means of production, when you've got generalised commodity production, and when you've got capitalists making profits from workers through wage labour, you've got capitalism. And that can manifest in more of a free market oriented form like in the United States, or a slightly more controlled social democratic form like in Norway. Importantly, governments can and do engage in capitalism themselves, including commodity production, the extraction of surplus value through wage labour, etc. There's a common myth that socialism is when big government does things, making capitalism the opposite of that. But if that were the case, then Saudi Arabia would be socialist with its nationalised oil company and the large public sector. But, as we know, Saudi Arabia is, well, an absolute monarchy that in many ways embodies capitalism taken to many of its natural conclusions. Now, it was mentioned earlier that there are various stages of historical development, but within each stage there are also various sub-stages. Within capitalism, we can identify three main sub-stages. Mercantile capitalism, that emerged from feudalism and primarily focused on controlling national and international trade. Industrial capitalism, which was dominant in the time when Karl Marx himself was writing and was characterised by a much sharper division of labour, heavy machinery, factories and so on. And imperialist capitalism, where capitalism has developed to such a point where capitalist monopolies rule the world. This is the substage that we still live under at the moment. We could go another level deeper again and talk about neoliberal capitalism as a stage within imperialist capitalism, a substage of a substage. But at that point we're mostly just splitting hairs as the underlying mechanisms of imperialist capitalism remain fundamentally unchanged. And don't worry, we're going to talk about all those underlying mechanisms in a later video dedicated specifically to imperialist capitalism. You're going to be sick of hearing about imperialism by the end of this series, if not already. Today we've looked at the meaning of capitalism as a system predicated on private ownership of the means of production, generalised commodity production, and wage labour, through which capitalists make profits from workers. We've also looked at the three main stages of capitalism: mercantile, industrial, and imperialist. We also addressed the idea that capitalism is when small government, freedom, and democracy. Which, no. So much no. Next up, what is socialism? Thank you for watching this video. Hopefully you found it useful in one way or another. If you're able to support this work, then please consider donating €1 or $1 per month over on Patreon, or a once-off donation over on Ko-fi. Links in the description box below. Thank you to Rare Hero, Cormac O'Brien, Dan Hunter, Red Corridor Raya, Christian Napales, MLM in Practice, Conrad Romano, Jason, Michaela Schmid, Marius Hex, Ryan Hodgson, Don Locrislava, Gabriel Bailey, Lapanian, Hugh Jass, The Royal Way Condition, Jess, Ian McShay, Dan Hunter, Soup, Pondus, Colin Walsh, Hagen Mitchells, Evan Crossland, Orkua Gorilla, Roja, and Daniel Hamilton. I wouldn't be able to make these videos without yous, and I certainly wouldn't be able to pay my bills. Cheers everyone, agus lang fo.
A massive 7.8 magnitude earthquake rocked Turkey and Syria. Families in Syria and Turkey are without shelter, water, or power in the midst of freezing temperatures. The earthquake is another devastating blow to families after years of conflict. Here's how you can help. The IRC teams on the ground provide life-saving healthcare, protection, and early recovery support. Your emergency gift can make a difference. And for a limited time, all first monthly gifts will be matched.
Charge your phone 40% faster with this new 4-port charging device. This $37 phone charger is taking the world by storm in the US. New groundbreaking technology can charge your phone's battery from 0 to 100% in record time and restore your phone's speed, performance, and battery life like it was when you bought it. But smartphone companies are trying their hardest to ban this device in the US. You might not know this, but smartphone manufacturers
Sweden, Portugal, Stalin's USSR, Mao's China, revolutionary Catalonia, Norway, all have been described as socialist at different times and by different people. And this causes a lot of problems for us when we're trying to understand what the word socialist means. The word has about 20 different meanings depending on who you're talking to, generally loosely connected to the idea of worker ownership of the means of production. But it's important to state from the outset that there is no one perfect, universally accepted definition of the word. It's always been a contested term. Following on from this, I can't claim to speak on behalf of social democrats, anarchists, or any kind of right-winger, but what I can do is provide a Marxist-Leninist and Marxist-Leninist Maoist understanding of it. So, let's find out, what is it from our perspective? Welcome to Socialism 101, a series designed to help educate people with no prior knowledge on the basics of socialism and communism from an explicitly Marxist-Leninist and Marxist-Leninist Maoist perspective with short and easily digestible videos. If this sounds interesting to you, then go ahead and hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell below. First and foremost, we view socialism as a stage of historical development. Specifically, the transitional stage between capitalism and communism. Earlier in the writings of Karl Marx, what we're now calling socialism would have been referred to as lower stage communism, while what we've been referring to as communism would have been higher stage communism. It's really from Lenin onwards that we arrive at this tidier separation of the historical stages into capitalism, then socialism, then communism. Now, as socialism is a transitional stage, it's a bit unstable and prone to backsliding into capitalism. In the socialist transition, you're either continuing the class struggle and moving forward to communism, which we call the socialist road, or you're abandoning the class struggle and backsliding into capitalism, the capitalist road. Importantly, you may reach a stage where you find that you've eliminated classes on paper within your country. Everyone is now legally working class or proletarian. But what about the illegal capitalists on the black market? What about those who've joined your leading communist party but have lingering capitalist ambitions and are working to restore capitalism? What about the bourgeoisie in the surrounding capitalist countries that are trying to destabilise your socialist country? Well, to combat these, we not only continue the class struggle under socialism, but in fact intensify it. And this class struggle continues until classes have been abolished all over the world, when we can finally move to a fully communist, stateless, classless, moneyless society. As much as we'd love to just hit the big red global communism switch, that process doesn't happen overnight, but is much more likely to take centuries to fully complete. Now, let's dial it back a bit and look at the main features of socialism from the ML and MLM perspective. We can loosely group these features under three main categories: the economic aspect, the political aspect, and the transformational aspect. Economically, socialist countries operate under the instruction from each according to their ability to each according to their work. You see the transformation from a capitalist society led by the anarchy of the market with its boom and bust cycles into a rationally planned, centralised economy. This of course eliminates problems like wasteful overproduction as we move towards primarily producing for use rather than production for profit. We see the transformation from private ownership of the means of production to public or state ownership, including nationalisations and collectivisations, under which you gradually see more direct worker control over the means of production develop over time. You also of course have cooperative ownership. And the trajectory for all of these is to progressively transition to the full communal ownership of communism. However, and this is important, this can only help to advance us closer towards a stateless, classless, moneyless society when it's led by the political power of the working class. Which brings us to the second category, the political aspect. Under capitalism, we live under the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. This means that the capitalists are in charge, that they're the ruling class, whether that's under a liberal democracy or under outright fascism. Socialist societies are politically led by the working class and its genuine representatives. This is called the dictatorship of the proletariat. Yeah, I know, we need a less scary sounding name for it. This is why you'll usually hear us saying something like working class governance instead these days. The governing body must at all times act in the genuine interests of the working class. How do we ensure that the leading Communist Party doesn't just become a group of power-hungry elitists disconnected from the masses, not representing the people? Easy. The leading party stays firmly connected to the masses through the mass line organisational methods. And if the leading party steps out of line, taking the people down a reactionary path, then the empowered masses rise up against the party itself as part of the cultural revolution that sets it back on the revolutionary communist path. Alright, maybe we're getting a bit ahead of ourselves here. Links below for more on those. Finally, the third category is the transformational aspect. Socialism is the transitional stage between capitalism and communism. At all times, the society must be progressing from capitalism towards a stateless, classless, moneyless society. This includes transformation of the relations of production by abolishing the capitalist class, advancing towards the full abolition of the commodity form,
I totally forgot to do
winding
this.
down production for exchange and phasing out the capitalist law of value,
It's fine. I got it.
progressively abolishing markets, eliminating wage labour, abolishing private property, moving production to public or cooperative property of the dictatorship of the proletariat, and eventually fully communal property as the capitalist class is abolished, and maintaining the socialist road to communism through cultural revolution, or rather, multiple cultural revolutions. Some, including Marx himself, also talk about the need for labour vouchers rather than money as we currently understand it in this transformational period, so as to prevent circulation, that MCM capitalist circuit discussed in a previous video, the free purchase of labour power and the means of production, etc. When assessing whether or not a country is socialist, we have to consider all three of these aspects: the economic, the political, and the transformational. If it doesn't satisfy all three, we don't consider it socialist. Even societies under the political leadership of a dictatorship of the proletariat that are actively building and transforming themselves towards socialism aren't necessarily socialist until they've also satisfied the economic aspect. See, for example, the new economic policy or NEP period of the USSR after the Bolshevik Revolution, which was state capitalist due to its economic structure before the USSR became actually socialist a number of years later. Likewise, there was a state capitalist period in China after the revolution which declared the People's Republic of China in 1949 before it became properly socialist a number of years later. Today we've looked at the Marxist-Leninist and Marxist-Leninist-Maoist understanding of socialism. It's comprised of three equally important and often overlapping aspects: the economic, the political, and the transformational. Without satisfying all three, we are unable to accurately describe society as socialist by this Marxist understanding. That being said, there are certain cases which are extremely clear-cut examples of socialism, like the post-NEP USSR, while there are also many other societies where the legitimacy is genuinely socialist according to these three categories is still fiercely debated among MLs and MLMs. Next up, we'll be diving back into the relations of production as we finally flesh out the answer to the question, what is class? Thank you for watching this video, hopefully you found it useful in one way or another. I am struggling financially at the moment, so please consider donating €1 or $1 per month over on Patreon or a once-off donation over on Ko-fi. Links in the description box below. Thank you to Rare Hero, Cormac O'Brien, Dan Hunter, Red Corridor Raya, Christian Napalis, Daniel H, MLM in Practice, Comrade Romano, Jason, Michaela Schmid, Mamarius Hex, Ryan Hodgson, Don Loquishleva, Gabriel Bailey, Lapanian, Hugh Jass, The Runway Condition, Jess, Ian McShay, Soup, Pontus, Colin Welch, Hagen Mitchells, Evan Crossland, Borakua Gorilla, and Polster Roman. I wouldn't be able to make these videos without you. Cheers everyone, agus slán fóil.
Many employees these days are nearing burnout because they're busting their balls to hit unrealistic deadlines set by someone far up the chain. And I want to help people like this remove the unnecessary and damaging stress from their life. Sharing how with an automated online business, it's possible to work for yourself and replace your corporate salary. You never have to suffer the humiliating injustice of being yelled at or missing an unrealistic deadline. How many times have you come home, take your stress and frustration out on your how much longer are you going to let yourself and your family suffer? Do you really want to experience burnout?
Now, you're probably familiar with the mainstream conception of social class that separates people into lower class, middle class, and upper class based on certain income levels. For example, we might think of someone who makes €20,000 per year or less as lower class or working class, €40,000 per year as middle class, and €100,000 per year as upper class. It doesn't matter how you make that money. According to this bourgeois conception, the determinant factor in deciding your class is the quantity of money received. But let's consider two cases of people making €20,000 per year. One is a factory worker, and the other is a small-time landlord who owns a house that they rent out. The factory worker makes their money through working and receiving an hourly wage, while the landlord makes their money from the labour of others, extracted through rent payments. By the earlier mainstream analysis, both should be seen as working class due to their identical income level of €20,000 per year. But when we move to socialism, a society led by and in the interests of the working class, only one of these people is significantly going to benefit, the factory worker. The landlord, on the other hand, is in trouble, because landlordism ends as we to bring about socialism, drastically improving the conditions for the working class. The landlord is materially incentivized to maintain capitalism, because it's the only way for them to continue to own private property and exploit workers, which is the source of their income. In truth, the two of these people are not members of the same class. One of them, our factory worker, is a member of the working class, while the other, our modern landlord, is a member of the capitalist class. Let's find out why. Welcome to Socialism 101, a series designed to help educate people with no prior knowledge on the basics of socialism and communism from an explicitly Marxist-Leninist and Marxist-Leninist-Maoist perspective, with short and easily digestible videos. Usually. If this sounds interesting to you, then go ahead and hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell below. Please share this video around on social media, Discord, Twitter, Reddit, Facebook, etc., as the YouTube algorithm is, to speak frankly, thoroughly fecking me over at the moment. Today we're going to talk about social class, first looking at the proletariat, then the bourgeoisie, then the petty bourgeoisie. But I want to give a quick heads up, I'll be providing quite strict definitions of the different classes here. For more advanced viewers who'd like to know why, I'll be explaining this after the main video is finished, which is why you'll see that this video is significantly longer than most of the other videos in this series. Okay, so what is a social class? Classes are large groups of people differing from each other by the place they occupy in a historically determined system of social production, by their relation, in most cases fixed and formulated in law, to the means of production, by their role in the social organisation of labour, and consequently, by the dimensions of the share of social wealth of which they dispose and the mode of acquiring it. Classes are groups of people, one of which can appropriate the labour of another, owing to the different places they occupy in a definite system of social economy. When we talk about class, we're returning to that part of the mode of production called the relations of production, which you may remember from the second video of this series. Class is determined by our concrete relations to the means of production, which leads to certain roles that we fulfill within the productive processes in a given society. Under capitalism, the two main ways that we relate to production are as workers or as capitalists. Workers and capitalists being those main roles. And this separates us into two main classes, the working class or proletariat and the capitalist class or bourgeoisie. Now, let's consult our old friend Frederick Engels to put some more concrete definitions on these two classes. By bourgeoisie is meant the class of modern capitalists, owners of the means of social production and employers of wage labour. By proletariats, the class of modern wage labourers who, having no means of production of their own, are reduced to selling their labour power in order to live. That's it. If you own the means of production and the main way you make your money is through purchasing other people's labour power through wage labour, then you're bourgeois. If, conversely, you don't own the means of production and the main way you make your money is through selling your labour power, either through an hourly wage or a salary, then you're proletarian. Simple. At least it's simple until we try to apply it to the real world and see that it's not quite as black and white as it first might seem. As you can imagine, there's a significant difference between a grocery shop worker who receives €20,000 a year from their job and a software developer who receives a salary of €80,000 per year. However, the difference between them is quantitative. That is, it concerns the quantity of money they receive, rather than qualitative, in that they both share the qualities of not owning the means of production and selling their labour power to survive, and therefore both fit Engels' definition of the proletariat. While the grocery shop worker is a standard proletarian, there are also various subclasses or strata within the proletariat to reflect the different conditions of its members. The software developer, like all high-earning professionals who get to enjoy a life of relative luxury under capitalism, belongs to a higher-up subclass or stratum within the proletariat called the labour aristocracy. Now, that's the high end of the proletariat. At the low end we have what's called the lumpen proletariat, which includes people who own no means of production but are often unable to even sell their labour power legally and often end up resorting to a life of petty crime. Think of those who have to resort to robbery, low-level illegal drug dealing and so on in order to survive. So that's the proletariat. Now let's move on to the owning class, the capitalists or the bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie refers to those who own the means of production and employ wage labour which generates the majority of their
46.
income. Think medium and large business
46
owners who make
games
most
today.
of their money from other people's labour, not their own. Now, there's a variety
Let's
of
put
strata
this
within
all
the
away right now
bourgeoisie
for
that
now.
relate quite differently to the global capitalist imperialist system. Some gain from it and support it, such as the imperialists themselves and the comprador bourgeoisie, while others see international capital as a threat to their local business and their livelihoods, such as the national bourgeoisie. But we'll have to return to this topic at a later stage after we've covered imperialism as the current highest stage of capitalism in order to develop a stronger understanding of what all this means. So this understanding of the proletariat and the bourgeoisie all maps on relatively easily to the popular ideas of the rich versus the poor, the 99% versus the 1%, and so on. But there's also a group in the middle, between the average proletarian and the average bourgeois. This group is called the petty bourgeoisie. For examples of this, think of a small business owner or an independent tradesperson who makes most of their money through their own labour. And this causes all kinds of headaches for us as Marxists because they own some small quantity of means of production, but the majority of their income doesn't come from them purchasing others' wage labour, but rather from their own labour. And with these characteristics, this group doesn't quite fit Engels' definition of either the proletariat or the bourgeoisie. In fact, it occupies a qualitatively unique position of possessing elements of both the proletariat and the bourgeoisie without fully satisfying the requirements for either one. Now let's put a more concrete definition on it. The petty bourgeoisie is that class which survives primarily by their own labour using their own small means of production. They do not sell their labour power to the capitalists, but neither do they, at least for the most part, exist by hiring wage labour. This would apply to a small business owner who works in their own shop, to a small handicraftsman who sells the products that he creates. It would also apply, for example, to a doctor with their own private practice. Remember, the main source of income for each of these is their own labour rather than the hired wage labour of others. Though there may be a small amount of that involved too, like if the doctor with the private practice has a hired secretary.
Wait, I got another broom
Okay, so
torch?
those are the main classes of capitalism. Today we've looked at class or social class, particularly as it presents under capitalism.
Two
Of course,
tomes,
different
two
systems have different relations of production
three
and consequently different
torches,
classes,
Jesus.
such as feudalism's peasants and landlords. But under capitalism there are two main classes, the
Let me go grab a
proletariat
drink.
and the bourgeoisie, as well as the petty bourgeois class occupying an unusual position between the two. Within the proletariat, there are also notable subclasses like the lumpen proletariat at the bottom end and the labour aristocracy at the top. Within the bourgeoisie, the most notable subgroups are the national bourgeoisie, the comprador bourgeoisie, and the full-blown imperialist bourgeoisie. It's also important to note that while capitalism dominates the world right now, there are also still remnants of feudal relations of production, which is why you'll still see peasants in many parts of the world. Next up, we're going to zoom out a little bit and answer that question, what is Marxism? Thank you for watching this video. Hopefully you found it useful in one way or another. I am struggling financially at the moment, so if you're able to, then please consider donating €1 or $1 per month over on Patreon or a once-off donation over on Ko-fi. Links in the description box below. Thank you to Rare Hero, Cormac O'Brien, Dan Hunter, Red Corridor Raya, Christian Nabalis, Daniel H, MLM in Practice, Roja, Libertarian Stalinist, Comrade Germano, Jason, Michaela Schmid, Amarius Hex, Ryan Hodgson, Donald Quishleva, Gabriel Bailey, Lapanian, Huge Ass, The Rhineway Condition, Jess, Ian McShay, Soup, Pontus, Hagen Mitchells, Evan Crossland, and Boraku Gorilla. Cheers everyone, August long fall. Okay, for those still here, the Beginner's Socialism 101 part's over. From here on out, things are going to get slightly more jargony and a lot less aesthetically focused. But here's some footage of dogs to visually occupy things while I talk anyway, because, well, who doesn't love dogs? I want to quickly address some potential concerns that some may have, specifically around how I use the term petty bourgeois, the lack of discussion of the semi-proletariat, the professional managerial class, and so on and so forth. I suspect some may argue that the class analysis put forward in this video is quite narrow and maybe a bit mechanical. I'm going to take a moment to explain why these are the positions I've put forward here in anticipation of some of the responses this video is likely to elicit from some of the more seasoned comrades in the audience. First and foremost, I've been an active Marxist for about 5 years now, and over that time I've been wrong over and over and over again about many different things. I fully accept that I may be wrong about this, and I welcome criticism to help correct this, addressing errors and blind spots so that we can collectively develop the correct position together. So keeping that in mind, I wanted to explain why I omitted the larger and more expansive definition of the petty bourgeoisie that includes highly paid salaried professionals, many of those with state jobs, people in managerial positions, etc. We can see this definition on Marxists.org, which I'll shorten for brevity's sake. Petty bourgeois. 1. The class of small proprietors, for example owners of small stores, and general handicrafts people of various types. This definition maps onto the definition of petty bourgeois proposed earlier in this video, so we're in line so far. However, Then Marxist.org gives a second definition of petty bourgeois that I specifically didn't put forward in this video. 2. The petty bourgeoisie also refers to the growing group of workers whose function is management of the bourgeois apparatus. These workers do not produce commodities, but instead manage the production, distribution and/or exchange of commodities and/or services owned by their bourgeois employers. While these workers are a part of the working class because they receive a wage and their livelihood is dependent on that wage, they are separated from working class consciousness because they have day-to-day control but not ownership over the means of production, distribution and exchange. So there are a few serious issues with this definition. It appears to erroneously make consciousness the determining factor of a person's class, completely overriding their objective material relations to the means of production. This definition concedes that they are workers and are a part of the working class, but we don't consider them working class because somehow their subjective consciousness separates them from the rest of the proletariat, which stems from the privilege they experience relative to other workers as a result of having some measure of control over the means of production.
Occupy Alan, hey yo, nice.
This poses a problem for Marxists as materialists, because this appears to be a philosophically idealist understanding of class. Class here is being determined more by one's thoughts and consciousness rather than their objective material conditions. It places primacy on the ideas rather than on the material. For while the individuals in these positions may be more prone to being ideologically aligned with the bourgeoisie, they are still materially proletarian, as this definition even concedes. And we are materialists, so we have to try our best to begin our analysis with material reality, rather than on one's notions about themselves which may lead to false consciousness. As Scott Harrison says in his essay, Comments on the Term Petty Bourgeoisie, when writing about this very topic, there's blatant confusion between the petty bourgeois ideology of one section of the working class with what actual social class they should be considered to be objectively a part of. The MLM goal, at least, is to define social classes on the basis of the different and distinct relationships that specific groups of people have to the means of production. Thus, as the proletariat, working class, bourgeoisie, capitalist class, and petty bourgeoisie, sometimes incorrectly identified with what is currently known as middle class, should be properly defined, each is quite distinct and separate from the others. Yes, individuals may be part of one of these classes in some respects and part of another in other respects. A worker may own some small number of shares of stock, for example, but the classes themselves must be different and distinct and their definitions must not overlap. And specifically, those in each class should share a common relationship to the means of production that is not included in the definitions of other classes. If this condition is abandoned, social classes lose most of their analytical usefulness, as indeed has happened to the quintessential bourgeois term, middle class. If we return to Engels' definition of the proletariat put forward earlier on, the class of modern wage labourers who, having no means of production of their own, are reduced to selling their labour power in order to live, we can see very clearly that all of the people who are considered petty bourgeois employees, such as public school teachers, supervisors, etc., 100% meet these criteria. They don't own the means of production and they're forced to sell their labour power through wage labour in order to survive. Conversely, they don't have anything to do with the definition of the bourgeoisie as the class of modern capitalists, owners of the means of social production and employers of wage labour. They're none of those things. They aren't the exploiters. Although it is true that some of them, including supervisors and managers, play a role in increasing the level of exploitation that occurs in order to maximise profits for the capitalists. So, I argue that we need to have a clear and concrete definition of classes that's rooted primarily in material reality. And this isn't to deny the importance of understanding how some sections of the proletariat may be more amenable to revolutionary ideology, while others may be more prone to identifying with reactionary bourgeois ideology or harbour bourgeois consciousness. We absolutely need to study all of these phenomena in great depth. But our analysis must always, as materialists, be primarily rooted in material reality. And as such, our analysis must begin with one's objective material conditions, one's concrete relations to the means of production. And from there, we can build on that and develop a deeper understanding of false consciousness and how bourgeois ideology has penetrated many strata of the proletariat. But as materialists, we need to be able to clearly delineate between people's ideologies and consciousness on one hand, and their objective class position based materially on their relations to the means of production on the other. I want to take a moment to say that this question of whether or not these workers are part of the proletariat is of great importance to us as socialists. Under the transition period of socialism, under the dictatorship of the proletariat, one of our main tasks is to abolish the bourgeoisie, to assimilate them to the proletariat. As everyone is then proletarian, there's no longer class distinction, and the proletariat thus abolishes itself as we reach the classless society of communism. Now, under the socialist transition period, categorising teachers and doctors and other professionals as bourgeois or petty bourgeois causes us an immediate problem, because our task as the dictatorship of the proletariat would then be to abolish them with the rest of the bourgeoisie and the petty bourgeoisie. As we can imagine when we think this through to the socialist transition period, it's quite detrimental to the development of socialism to identify them as bourgeois or petty bourgeois. Simply put, using one concrete example, we need doctors. We most definitely should not be trying to abolish them. Now, regarding the so-called professional managerial class, or PMC, I made a video about this some time back laying out many of the problems that have been discussed here, namely that it's just not a class from a Marxist materialist perspective, while still accepting that we do need to understand the unique features of these groupings as part of the proletariat. As for the semi-proletariat, I don't see the necessity of this term. To the best of my knowledge, it appears to refer mostly to the lowest sections of the petty bourgeoisie, who are themselves deeply exploited and in many cases in worse off positions materially than the average proletarian. And this state of being deeply exploited is suggested to give these people a kind of proletarian consciousness, meaning their interests more closely align with the interests of the proletariat than the bourgeoisie. This falls into the same trap mentioned earlier, where better off sections of the proletariat are considered petty bourgeois based on their consciousness, their ideology and their political inclinations. And, though in reverse this time, this still gives primacy to ideas and consciousness over material reality. This group is objectively petty bourgeois in that they, to return to the earlier definition, survive primarily on their own labour, using their own small means of production. They don't sell their labour power to the capitalists, nor do they exist for the most part by hiring wage labour. Nonetheless, they are extremely exploited and oppressed in various ways. I would therefore suggest that it's better that we can clearly delineate their objective position as part of the petty bourgeoisie, while also acknowledging that they are extremely likely to have what we might call proletarian consciousness, and are consequently very likely to be allies to the proletarian revolution. Okay, so those are my positions right now. Hopefully that explains my thinking a bit and helps to clarify why I left these categorizations out of the initial Socialism 101 part of this video. However, and this is really important, people far smarter and more well-read than me do sometimes use these more expansive categorizations. People who are actual authority figures in the international communist movement. Mao, for example, can be seen referring to the semi-proletariat in analysis of the classes in Chinese society. In the same text, he also calls primary and secondary school teachers petty bourgeois. You can see that he uses a more expansive definition of petty bourgeois than I used in the initial video here. So the comrades who argue in favour of this expanded definition will find plenty of justification for doing so among the greats. However, warning, hot take coming here, the fact that one of the great communists said this doesn't necessarily make it objectively true for us as scientific socialists. To claim that it does would be to treat these figures theologically, and would certainly be falling into the trap of dogmatic book worship. So, in that spirit, we should be open to respectfully disagreeing with these figures if we ever feel they're incorrect, or perhaps if their analysis was correct for the particular time and context in which they were writing, but is no longer true or applicable to the modern world. Scott Harrison's essay touches on this a bit more, so I'd strongly recommend if comrades are interested in the arguments that I've been putting forward in the laddered section of this video, then they should absolutely read that essay and engage with it more there. Again, before we wrap up, I want to stress that I may be wrong about all this. It may be the case that in a few months or a year, comrades will help me to realise the errors in this analysis, in which case I'll make a part 2 to this video correcting those mistakes. I want to give a massive thanks to MLM in Practice for talking me through this conversation in depth, offering that alternative expansive perspective. I suspect this fantastic comrade will at some stage make a Paul Marin is wrong about class video to rival the mighty work of Premier Lyles, and I very much look forward to continuing the conversation on this topic and developing a clear analysis collectively. I also want to thank Roymere, Vuchko and the Peace Report for sending on materials which have helped to expand my understanding of this topic, whether or not we've necessarily come to the same conclusions on it. I especially welcome all of your contributions and criticisms of this video. Thank you very much, comrades. Cheers everyone, agus slán go fóill. What is Marxism? Isn't that just the same thing as communism? Or socialism? Maybe? Well, thankfully, you don't need to worry about questions like these because you've already watched the previous episodes of this series which explain those terms. And you know that socialism and communism are stages of historical development which come after feudalism and capitalism. And since you've been studiously following this series, you've already been learning Marxist theory, from understanding modes of production, to property, to social classes, and everything else covered thus far. Give yourself a pat on the back, you're killing it. But it's the 7th episode in, and we still haven't defined what Marxism actually is. So, let's go ahead and do exactly that. Welcome to Socialism 101, a series designed to help educate people with no prior knowledge on the basics of socialism and communism from an explicitly Marxist-Leninist and Marxist-Leninist-Maoist perspective with short and easily digestible videos. If this sounds interesting to you, then go ahead and hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell below. Please share this around on social media as the YouTube algorithm is thoroughly fecking me over at the moment. Now, Marxism's a tricky thing to define because there are so many different facets to it that no one single short definition will ever be sufficient. So, the purpose of this video is not to provide one perfect definition, but rather to briefly introduce some of the major Marxist concepts and provide a basic backdrop so that we can dive into each of these individually in much greater detail in later videos. Marxism on one hand refers simply to a body of thought, the political and economic theories of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. On the other hand, Marxism is an all-encompassing worldview, an ever-expanding theoretical toolbox that empowers us to look behind the curtains, unveiling the hidden processes which have given rise to all that we see before us, and to consequently more deeply understand the very nature of reality itself. But, let's be honest, this explanation conceals more than it reveals. And that's not good enough because one of the main purposes of Marxism is to demystify and to help us see clearly. However, Marxism isn't just another philosophy, despite regular claims to the contrary. Where philosophy seeks only to analyse and understand, Marxism is a scientific theory that generates revolution and propels society forward to its next historical stage. But long before we arrive at the inevitable conclusion of the working class rising up to overthrow the capitalists who've been robbing us of the surplus value that we've generated through our labour, which they call their profits, we need to understand that Marxism is, at its most basic level, simply a method of analysis. This method is rooted in what's called dialectical materialism.
That's what I missed, the
Dialectical
fucking
materialism
hammer.
consists of two components, dialectics and materialism. Dialectics is the analysis of contradictions, or conflicting opposing forces, and how these contradictions drive change. Materialism refers to where our analysis begins, with matter, atoms, scientifically verifiable, concrete material reality. This is opposed to beginning with ideas, or religious or spiritual notions. Knowledge isn't handed down from the heavens, but rather built up from the ground. The application of dialectical materialism to world history and societal development is called historical materialism. Now, when Marxists talk about Marxism, at its core, this is the method that we're generally referring to, historical materialism. Through this method, we can understand that the contradictions within societies, and more precisely the class contradictions, become the motor for social historical transformation. Arising from these class contradictions is class struggle, and it's this conflict which propelled us from slave society to feudalism, from feudalism to capitalism, and what gets us from capitalism to socialism. A modern example of class contradiction would be between the working class or proletariat and the capitalist class or bourgeoisie. The working class generates value through their labour, while the capitalists appropriate a large portion of that value created. What capitalists call their profits is really just stolen surplus value that workers have generated. Capitalists seek to extract as much surplus value from workers as possible, while workers seek to end this exploitation and receive the full value created by their labour. This is a contradiction inherent to the capitalist system that can only be resolved by moving towards the next stage of social historical development, socialism. How do we get to socialism? The same way we got from feudalism to capitalism, the only way that's ever successfully progressed society from one system to the next. The revolutionary overthrow of the exploiters by the exploited, thus resolving the class contradiction between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, propelling history forward to its next stage. There's a lot to unpack in what's just been said, but don't worry because we're going to flesh this all out a lot more in the next video, which is going to be dedicated specifically to dialectical and historical materialism. Now, beyond the core of dialectical and historical materialism upon which everything else is built, Marxism can also refer to a number of other concepts developed by Marx and Engels, most notably including the Marxist law of value, which, to oversimplify, reveals that the value of a commodity, manifested in its exchange value as opposed to its use value, is determined by the socially necessary labour time that it takes to produce it. Base and superstructure, which reveal the way in which the economic base of a society, in our case the capitalist mode of production, gives rise to the superstructure of society, which then in turn helps to reinforce that base. Examples of the superstructure would include things like the state and other political structures, the law, the media, art, the education system, religious institutions, and even ideologies themselves, which all help to reinforce that economic base, which in turn reinforces the superstructure, and so on and so forth. Commodity fetishism, which reveals the way in which the commodities that we encounter on the market mystify us and obscure the real human relations which were involved in the creation of these commodities. For example, it's often nearly impossible for us to know the workers in the sweatshops and the conditions under which the products we encounter on the market have been created. Thus, the real social relations between people ourselves are hidden, and in its place appear to us merely relations between things, those things generally being the money in our pocket and the product on that shelf. Marxism also includes his theory of alienation, which describes the various ways that working people become alienated, that is, separated or detached, through the process of capitalist production, particularly in how the products of a worker's labour don't belong to the worker themselves, but instead belong to the capitalist who pays that worker's wage or salary. Now, these are all massive oversimplifications, but don't worry because we're going to dive into each one in much greater detail over the next few videos. Importantly, all of these Marxist concepts coalesce and reveal to us the unsustainable nature of capitalism from a thorough analysis of class society in its totality. And not only do they diagnose the problems, they also provide the solution to resolve the contradictions inherent to capitalism. Today we've looked at the key components of Marxism. We've gone directly to its core by touching on dialectical materialism and its application to socio-historical development, historical materialism. We've briefly dipped our toes into the waters of the Marxist law of value, base and superstructure, commodity fetishism, and Marxist theory of alienation, and we've set the backdrop for studying these Marxist concepts and more in greater depth in the upcoming videos. One last thing, it should also be pointed out that Marxism is a developing scientific theory. Since the time of Marx's writing, it's been greatly built upon, developed, and expanded through the rich experiences of real-world class struggle. World historical socialist revolutions have led to qualitative leaps forward in Marxist theory. In light of Russia's Bolshevik Revolution, it progressed from Marxism to Marxism-Leninism. And in light of the Chinese Revolution, it progressed from Marxism-Leninism to Marxism-Leninism-Maoism. But what do each of these theoretical developments entail? Well, those are topics for more advanced parts of this series. But for now, it'll suffice to say that Marxism is not something that stuck in the 1800s, or even the 1900s, but is instead a theoretical method that's always growing by learning from its failures and building upon its successes, right up to this very day. Next up, we're going to dive back into dialectics and deepen our understanding of historical materialism. Thank you for watching this video, hopefully you found it useful in one way or another. I am struggling financially at the moment, so if you're able to, then please consider donating €1 or $1 per month over on Patreon, or a once-off donation over on Ko-fi. Links in the description box below. Thank you to Rare Hero, Cormac O'Brien, Dan Hunter, Christian Napalis, Daniel H, MLM in Practice, Jason, Michaela Schmid, Mamarius Hex, Ryan Hodgson, Don Loquishleva, Lepanion, Hugh Das, The Rhineway Condition, Jess, Ian McShay, Soup, Hagen Mitchells, Evan Crossland, and Borku Gorilla. I wouldn't be able to make these videos without you. Cheers everyone, agus long fo.
Turning decades of information into a source of future inspiration. That's what really matters.
Dialectical materialism is the philosophical underpinning of Marxism. This foundational part of Marxism requires a significant amount of attention and study, far beyond the scope of what's possible in a short video like this. After you've watched this video, take a look at the reading and resources list with books, articles, podcasts and other YouTube videos in the description box below and dive into those materials to continue to develop your understanding of this important topic. Now, in order to develop a well-rounded understanding of dialectical materialism, we need to consider both of its aspects in detail, dialectics and materialism. But first of all, we need to clarify a couple of points up front. When we talk about materialism, we're using the philosophical understanding of the term rather than the popular concept of being materialistic. We're not talking about being overly concerned with worldly possessions, being obsessed with acquiring consumer goods or anything like that. The philosophical materialism that we'll be talking about today is in contrast to philosophical idealism, which is not to be confused with the popular usage of the term idealist to describe a person who's guided more by lofty, unrealistic ideals rather than by practical, realistic, grounded considerations. So that's what we're not talking about. Now let's get into what we are talking about. Dialectics, materialism, and their combination into dialectical materialism. Welcome to Socialism 101, a series designed to help educate people with no prior knowledge on the basics of socialism and communism from an explicitly Marxist-Leninist and Marxist-Leninist-Maoist perspective, with short and hopefully easily digestible videos. If this sounds interesting to you, then go ahead and hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell below. Now, dialectics as a concept has been around for thousands of years, and we can trace its roots back to both ancient Eastern and ancient Western philosophy. We can look to the works of Plato to see demonstrations of an early idealist dialectical method. These are dialogues between two characters who argue back and forth with one another, refining their arguments in the process through exposing flaws in each other's positions, and together developing the correct conclusion. The first person will initially present an argument, the thesis. The other person will then present a counter-argument, the antithesis. And through argument, a more refined position is reached between them, the synthesis. But that's not the end of it. Now this synthesis becomes the new thesis. And in opposition to this new thesis, we see a new antithesis emerge. And from this new thesis and antithesis, we arrive at another synthesis, and so on and so forth. And this triad of thesis, antithesis, synthesis is often the way in which we're taught to understand later iterations of dialectics. Most notably
Mayo.
the idealist dialectics of George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. However, it's important to state clearly that Hegel himself never formulated it this way, and that this simplified formulation can cause problems in trying to correctly understand dialectics. Importantly, rather than seeing the thesis emerging and existing by itself for some time, only to be challenged by the antithesis at an indeterminate later stage, the thesis and antithesis, the two contradictory aspects, emerge simultaneously. For a less abstract and more concrete example of this, there can be no exploiter without the exploited, no bourgeoisie without a proletariat. Their existence depends on each other, and so both emerge simultaneously in unity and contradiction with one another. A unity of opposites. Now, you'll notice that by introducing the dialectical relationship between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, we've shifted gears from focusing on the contradiction between simple conversational ideas, the realm of philosophical idealism, and have instead moved to discussing class contradictions, the realm of philosophical materialism. Unlike Hegelian dialectics which rely on idealism, Marxist dialectics are materialists. But what does this mean? Philosophical idealism posits that existence is inseparable from human perception, that reality primarily stems from the mind perceptually or from ideas of some kind. This is exemplified in the statement, "I think, therefore I am," wherein thought precedes and affirms reality. The beginning of existence here is subjective thought. Extreme versions of philosophical idealism can be seen in solipsism, which holds that a person can only be certain that their own mind exists, and that everything else outside of that is potentially just an illusion. Philosophical materialism flips idealism on its head, becoming "I am, therefore I think," wherein objective existence precedes subjective perception. Rather than assuming that all existence begins with the ideal, with subjective thought, with consciousness, the products of the mind, philosophical or ontological materialists accept that there is existence beyond and before our mere perception, that matter objectively exists independently of whether or not we subjectively perceive it. In stark contrast to idealists' notions, Marx posits that it is not the consciousness of men that determines their being, but, on the contrary, their social being that determines their consciousness. Marx believed that this idea of a mind that somehow exists separately to our physical bodies is incorrect. It is impossible to separate thought from matter that thinks. This matter is the substratum of all changes going on in the world. Thought then comes from matter, the brain being the material organ of thought. Lenin summarized it when he stated that materialism in general recognizes objectively real being, matter, as independent of consciousness, sensation, experience. Consciousness is only the reflection of being, at best an approximately true, adequate, perfectly exact reflection of it. In other words, materialism holds that objective material reality exists whether or not we subjectively perceive it, and that matter precedes thought. Therefore, materialists begin our analyses by studying matter. Now, this battle between idealism and materialism has been a long-standing debate in philosophy. However, modern science has long since come to embrace materialism as its starting point for research. But where the popular materialism of scientific discourse often falls into the trap of being a materialism that finds itself static, rigidly fixed in one place, Marxist materialism is anything but static. Rather, Marxists view all matter as interconnected and constantly in motion, constantly changing. Darwin's theory of evolution illustrates this interconnectedness of everything in the material world and the process of constant change and motion. Everything that currently exists only does so as the result of processes that have been ongoing for billions of years. Processes of dialectical development between opposing or contradictory forces. It's precisely the study of dialectics which allows us to move beyond metaphysical rigidity and understand the perpetual motion of the material world. Lenin reminds us that dialectics in the proper sense is the study of contradiction in the very essence of objects. Objects here meaning literally all phenomena. Let's take a deeper look now at contradiction through the fundamental laws of dialectics.
Dialectics. How can we better understand it and apply it to the world around us, and especially in our organizing efforts? Well, one of the fine gentlemen behind me laid out 3 fundamental laws to help us understand dialectics. The first law is the unity and struggle of opposites. The second law is the transformation from quantity into quality. And the third law is the negation of the negation. Let's break these laws down. The law of the unity and struggle of opposites holds that the unity of opposites exists in all objects and processes from beginning to end. Vladimir Lenin once said, "The splitting of a single whole in the cognition of its contradictory parts is the essence of dialectics." And Mao Zedong once said, "The law of contradiction in things, that is, the law of the unity of opposites, is the basic law of materialist dialectics." Within every object, 2 contradictory aspects form the entire object. These 2 aspects both unite and struggle, pushing that object forward, placing it in constant motion. This is also known as the law of contradiction. Lenin said it best: in mathematics, plus and minus, differential and integral. In mechanics, action and reaction. In physics, positive and negative electricity. In chemistry, the combination and dissociation of atoms. In social science, the class struggle. 1 divides into 2 is another way of identifying the contradictions within an object or process. In this case, mathematics is divided into plus and minus, physics into positive and negative electricity, so on and so forth. As dialecticians, we must find the 2 contradictory aspects of that object in order to understand it concretely. This is the law of unity and struggle of opposites. The law of the transformation of quantity into quality. This law explains that gradual quantitative changes give rise to revolutionary qualitative changes. Basically, quantity is gradual change, quality is revolutionary change. This law takes into account how all things and processes go from being one thing or process to transforming into another thing or process. The essence of a thing gradually changes through increases and decreases, but after a certain level of gradual change, a qualitative leap occurs which fundamentally changes that thing or process. With this law, we must understand that a fundamental change that occurs within an object doesn't just occur with gradual changes, but a qualitative leap must occur for actual change to occur. For example, when we heat water up until it boils, the temperature gradually changes until it transforms from a liquid to a gas, representing a qualitative change. Or when we freeze water until it transforms into a solid state known as ice. Examples like these are found all over the universe, including human society and human thought. In the Marxist sense, when we apply this law to society, the qualitative change is revolution. This is the second law of the transformation of quantity into quality. The law of the negation of the negation. This is sometimes referred to as negation and affirmation, and the simplest way to explain this law is when the new supersedes the old. When the old state of an object reaches its limit before a qualitative change occurs, this is the first negation. After surpassing this limit, the object transforms into a new state, which is the second negation. Therefore, we have a negation of the negation. The negation, or the limit, is negated or superseded by something new. Karl Marx described an example of this law. The capitalist mode of appropriation, the result of the capitalist mode of production, produces capitalist private property. This is the first negation of individual property as founded on the labor of the proprietor. But capitalist production begets, with the inexorability of a law of nature, its own negation. It is the negation of the negation. This does not re-establish private property for the producer, but it gives him individual property based on the acquisitions of the capitalist era, meaning on cooperation and the possession in common of the land and the means of production. Negation, in the Marxist sense, does not mean completely wiping out the existence of something. In the process of an object transforming from one state to another, old remnants of the old state still remain in the new state. When feudalism became dominant after slavery, slavery still remained. When capitalism became dominant after feudalism, old remnants of feudalism still remained. Even when socialism becomes dominant after capitalism, slavery, feudalism, and capitalism still have remnants which remain and must be overcome in order to reach communism on a global level. A negation of the negation means a transformation from the old state into a new state of an object, when the new supersedes the old, but in a way which has continuity with the past, but also ruptures from it. This is what Marxists mean when we say progress does not travel in a straight line, but in spirals. Lenin described it as, human knowledge is not or does not follow a straight line, but a curve, which endlessly approximates a series of circles, a spiral. To sum up, life, society, and ideas are in a continual process of gradual changes which can build up into revolutionary qualitative changes due to the contradictions within a process. And this is all pushed forward by the unity of opposites within that process. And there we have the three laws of dialectics which form the basis of the philosophy of Marxism.
Today we've taken a look at the development of both dialectics and materialism. We've traced dialectics all the way back to Plato, through Hegel, and up to the modern day. We've also explored the differences between philosophical idealism and philosophical materialism, as well as connecting that materialism to dialectics in order to better understand the interconnectedness of all things which exist in constant motion. Will from the Peace Report laid out Friedrich Engels' three fundamental laws of dialectics. 1. The law of the unity of opposites, wherein two aspects of a contradiction are in opposition, yet are interdependent and so united. 2. The law of the transformation of quantity into quality, wherein incremental quantitative changes in quantity, give way to revolutionary qualitative transformations, changes in quality. And 3. The law of the negation, wherein the old gives way to and is supplanted by the new. In short, dialectical materialism is the philosophical underpinning of Marxism, which posits that there are opposing forces which exist within all phenomena, and that these contradictions drive change in the material world. Next up, we'll be looking at how this applies to social historical development as we dive into historical materialism. And I know some of you are itching to learn more about contradiction, given that it's a fundamental part of understanding dialectical materialism, so that'll be covered in the following video. Thank you for watching this video, hopefully you found it useful and not too overwhelming. Don't worry or feel discouraged if this topic just hasn't clicked yet. Dialectics takes a long time to master and it can be quite a frustrating process. I strongly recommend you dive into the reading and resources list in the description box below to help you develop your understanding of this important topic. I want to give a massive thank you to Will from the Peace Report for his excellent contribution to this video. Will's currently working on a massive project diving into these very topics in much greater detail, so make sure to get over to his channel right now to subscribe and be notified when it's released. Thank you to all the supporters on Patreon, I couldn't do this without you. Thank you Michaela Schmid, Christian Nepales, Cormac O'Brien, Brian Roos, Alfonso Dingo Torres, Mekalova, Key to the Fields, Rock Artist, Todd Sprang, CJ Mika, Nike the Sage, Train H13, Meowsifer, Hunter Johnson, Rare Hero, Donlo Quishleva, Sixty Velan, Lepanian, Kale Marks, Roja, Blair Don, Rich Vert, MLM in Practice, Eric Lindahl, ZK Goody, Laverna Wintermore, Kyle Rapp, Vuchko, Michael Stone, Doc Toma, Ayob Farah, Becky, Pastor Jubert, Romuald Bettier, A Mouthwash Bottle, Mr. Miyamoto, Kyle King, Jack M, Wonderbad, Moelahim, JT Chapman, Jose, Joseph Shepard, Jack Schneidman, Comrade Amara, Wealth for the 99%, Spoop, and Trailer Park Communist. Cheers everyone, August Long Fall.
Hi, I'm Marcus Trufant, former Seattle Seahawk. You probably don't think about it much, but thousands get hurt on the job every year in our state. Some are small injuries, but others can be serious and take months for people to recover. LNI is the winning combination when it comes to helping injured workers heal and return to work. And get this, they have entry-level positions open now.
Slave society, feudalism, capitalism, socialism. What is it that separates these different stages of history?
A lot.
Is it purely technological development? Is it just the great ideas of individual members of the respective ruling classes building and structuring society according to their grand visions? Marxists argue no. Instead, we understand societies and their respective modes of production as being the products of particular material conditions. In other words, we base our understanding on the materialist conception of history, or historical materialism. The materialist conception of history starts from the proposition that the production and, next to production, the exchange of things produced is the basis of all social structure. That in every society that has appeared in history, the manner in which wealth is distributed and society divided into classes or estates is dependent upon what is produced, how it is produced, and how the products are exchanged. So what are the main differences between the various stages of history? Production and exchange. Under capitalism, we produce and exchange very different kinds of products in very different ways to what was seen under slave society or feudalism. For example, imagine trying to explain purchasing a Netflix subscription on your smartphone using online payment methods to someone from ancient Greece. It's not just a problem of explaining technological development, but the nature of the product itself, how it was produced, and how it's being exchanged would all seem completely alien to someone existing within the confines of ancient Greek slave society. The material conditions required to make this purchase possible are so vastly qualitatively different to that which existed within slave society that it'd be impossible to even comprehend such an exchange. So how do we get from there to here? How does society move from one stage of historical development with a particular mode of production to another? Today we're going to apply the philosophy of Marxism, dialectical materialism, to historical development to find out. And in doing so, we're going to dive into the science of Marxism, historical materialism. Welcome to Socialism 101, a series designed to help educate people with no prior knowledge on the basics of socialism and communism from an ML and MLM perspective with short and easily digestible videos. If this sounds interesting to you, then go ahead and hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell below. We're often presented a narrative about societal progression and development that centres around great men with lofty ideals who, through their bravery and boldness, push the wheel of history forward to its next stage. However, Marxists posit that the final causes of all social changes and political revolutions are to be sought not in men's brains, not in man's better insight into eternal truth and justice, but in changes in the modes of production and exchange. They are to be sought not in the philosophy, but in the economics of each particular epoch. Marxists recognised that we didn't progress from slave society to feudalism, nor from feudalism to capitalism, as a result solely of impressive individuals with big ideas. Rather, these historical progressions were the result of contradictions within each historical epoch being resolved, specifically through the development of the society's productive forces and the transformation of the relations of production through class struggle. This key concept uncovered by historical materialism, that society progresses from one stage of historical development to another, from one mode of production to another, through the struggles of classes that exist in contradiction with each other, is why Marx wrote that the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggle. Within each mode of production, there are exploiting and exploited classes that come into contradiction with and struggle against each other. Slave owners and slaves, landlords and serfs, capitalists and workers. How do we identify these opposing forces? Through historical materialist analysis. Let's take the modern example of the contradiction between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. To identify this, we use the dialectical materialist philosophical approach of studying the contradictory aspects within an object. Here, the capitalist mode of production's relations of production. From our understanding of dialectics, we know that the two aspects of a contradiction exist in both unity and opposition with one another. We know that the bourgeoisie and proletariat rely on each other for their existence, but have opposing interests and so will struggle against one another towards the resolution of the contradiction, and in so doing will drive social historical change. We know that this struggle, the class struggle between the two, will entail incremental quantitative changes which will give rise to a revolutionary qualitative transformation. That the negation will finally be negated with the realization of the abolition of class society in communism. When we apply dialectical materialism to society and historical development, like this analysis of capitalism's contradiction between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie and what the resolution of this contradiction entails, we're engaging in historical materialist analysis. By understanding how opposing forces drive change in general with dialectical materialism, we understand that social historical development is no exception. The science of historical materialism posits this general law of motion, that the struggle between opposing classes in society is the propelling force for transitioning from one mode of production to another. That is to say, history moves according to class struggle. Now, importantly, history isn't nearly as linear as it might seem from this discussion so far. Societies may skip certain stages, or they may advance to one stage only to regress later, as we saw with the defeat of 20th century socialism and the re-establishment of capitalism. But in saying that, even with these regressions, capitalism once again creates the conditions necessary for socialism through its class contradictions, through the contradiction of its social character of production and its private form of appropriation, and so on, which continue to push society forward to its next historical stage, socialism. Today we've taken a look at the application of dialectical materialism to social historical development in order to understand the science of Marxism, historical materialism. Through this, we understand that the various stages of historical development are the result of particular material conditions which give rise to different methods of production and exchange. We've learned that history moves according to class struggle, not according to the ideas of great men. And we've looked at the principal contradiction of the capitalist mode of production which necessitates resolution in the form of revolution, thus progressing society onto the next stage of social historical development, socialism. Next up, we're going to deepen our understanding of dialectics by diving further into contradiction. Thank you to all the supporters on Patreon. I couldn't do this without yous. Thank you Ian McShay, Hugh Gopnik, Matthias Hogness, Annex Magnus, Burku Gorilla, Ryan Hodson, Soup, Evan Crossland, Madeline, Sonic232, Sagan, Michaela Schmid, Christian Nepales, Cormac O'Brien, Brian Roos, Alfonso Dingo Torres, Mekalova, Key to the Fields, Rock Artist, Todd Sprang, Nike Decide, Train H13, Meowsifer, Hunter Johnson, Rare Hero, Donald O'Quishleva, Sixney Valen, Lapanian, Kale Marks, Roja, Blair Don, Rich Vert, MLM in Practice, Eric Lindahl, ZK Goody, Laverna Wintermore, Kyle Rapp, Vuchko, Michael Stone, Doctoma, Ayab Farah, Becky, Pastor Joubert, Romuald Bedier, A Mouthwash Bottle, Mr. Miyamoto, Kyle King, Jack M, Wonderbad, Moilahim, JT Chapman, Jose, Joseph Shepard, Jack Schneidman, Conrad Amara, Wealth for the 99%, Spoop, and Trailer Park Communist. Cheers everyone, agus slán go fóill.
Yo, what is this sound? Oh no, what's this?
You've probably noticed terms like contradiction, antagonism, principal aspect, and so on being used throughout this series, and used quite differently to how they might be understood in the popular context. We've spoken about the antagonistic contradiction between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, and about how the bourgeoisie is the dominant aspect in capitalism. But what does this actually mean? What exactly is a contradiction? Where do we find these contradictions? How exactly do we determine which aspect of the contradiction is dominant? Are contradictions always antagonistic, or can they be non-antagonistic? Isn't this all just abstract nonsense with no bearing on the real world? Today we're going to take a look at the answers to these questions and more. Welcome to Socialism 101, a series designed to help educate people with no prior knowledge on the basics of socialism and communism from an ML and MLM perspective with short and easily digestible videos. If this sounds interesting to you, then go ahead and hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell below. What exactly is a contradiction? A contradiction is when two seemingly opposed forces are simultaneously present within a particular situation, an entity, or an event. So when we refer to contradictions, we're referring to the presence of the two opposing forces within phenomena, within objects, within processes. We refer to each of these opposing forces as the aspects of the contradiction. The proletariat constitutes one aspect of a contradiction, while the bourgeoisie constitutes the other aspect. Now these contradictions are everywhere, emerging within every facet of existence, both in ideological phenomena and objective phenomena, in mind and matter. Contradiction is universal, and this movement of opposites exists within all objects and processes from beginning to end. Every single thing in the world is in motion. If it is no longer in motion, it ceases to exist. This is even true of inanimate objects that are made up of cells that are put together at the same time they are breaking down and decomposing. Every single thing has its own internal contradictions, constituting the primary fundamental cause of its motion and development. While interactions and interrelations with other things, external contradictions, are secondary factors in development. That being said, while contradictions exist everywhere and everything is interconnected, each contradiction contains its own unique, particular characteristics which constitute the nature and essence of that thing. An egg and a rock have very different contradictions internally within each of them, and when subjected to similar external factors, such as applying heat, one of them will transform into a chicken while the other will remain a rock. This is because, despite both being subjected to the same external force of heat, there are particular internal causes within the egg providing the basis for this transformation into a chicken. So while contradiction itself is universal, each particular contradiction is unique, even to the point where you'll notice that the contradiction between similar forces will be handled differently in different circumstances. For example, class struggle, even specifically between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, manifests in very different ways in different places and times. While of course having similarities due to the universal aspects of this contradiction, the Bolshevik Revolution and the Chinese Revolution played out very differently due to the unique particularities of each situation. The particularities of contradictions have to be studied carefully in order to understand how they are properly resolved. As Mao states in On Contradiction, qualitatively different contradictions can only be resolved by qualitatively different methods. For instance, the contradiction between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie is resolved by the method of socialist revolution. The contradiction between the working class and the peasant class in socialist society is resolved by the method of collectivization and mechanization in agriculture. Contradiction within the Communist Party is resolved by the method of criticism and self-criticism, and so on and so forth. Different contradictions are resolved in different ways. There is no one-size-fits-all approach. Now, when we're analysing contradictions, we'll notice that there's a seemingly endless number of contradictions that exist at a given time. So we always need to ask, what is the principal contradiction? There are many contradictions in the process of development of a complex thing, and one of them is necessarily the principal contradiction whose existence and development determine or influence the existence and development of the other contradictions. For instance, in capitalist society, the two forces in contradiction, the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, form the principal contradiction. The principal or primary contradiction has a knock-on effect that influences all other contradictions, which we call secondary contradictions. Examples of secondary contradictions would be the contradiction between the petty bourgeoisie and the big bourgeoisie, between competing capitalist powers, between bourgeois liberal democracy and fascism, and so on. These secondary contradictions are all determined, or at least heavily influenced by, the primary contradiction. Though, importantly, the primary contradiction is not permanently fixed or static and can shift over time. Secondary contradictions can become primary and vice versa. Now, when looking at contradictions, we always need to uncover what the principal aspect of that contradiction is. While we need to study all aspects and avoid being one-sided in our analysis, the principal aspect or dominant aspect will determine the nature of a thing, so we always need to ask which aspect is stronger in a contradiction. For example, in the contradiction between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie is the principal dominant aspect. They are the stronger force due to their bourgeois state apparatus, their police, their military, and so on. Now, the existence of the bourgeoisie doesn't automatically make a society capitalist, such as in the late stages of feudalism when the bourgeoisie existed as a smaller, weaker force. It's only when the bourgeoisie becomes the dominant force that we can say that the nature of a society is definitively capitalist. However, similarly to the shifting principal contradiction, the principal aspect of a contradiction is also not fixed or static, and instead is always changing as a result of the struggle of opposites. The bourgeoisie may be dominant right now, but it hasn't always been this way, and it won't always be. Through revolutionary class struggle, putting the dictatorship of the proletariat in place, the proletariat becomes the principal or dominant aspect of the contradiction, fundamentally changing the nature of that society, though we'll return to the implications of this point a little bit later. Now, the contradiction between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie is what we would call an antagonistic contradiction. This is a hostile relationship of exploitation that can't be resolved peacefully, as history bears testament to. However, there are also non-antagonistic contradictions that can be resolved peacefully. As mentioned earlier, the contradiction between the proletariat and the peasantry is non-antagonistic and can be resolved through the means of agricultural collectivization and mechanization. Problem solved without even so much as a scratch. Let's say you and your friend have a disagreement over whether or not a certain country is socialist. This in itself is a non-antagonistic contradiction, so the two of you can simply sit down and have a chat about it and come to a resolution together. There's no need to kill each other over it. But unfortunately, this is a problem on the left, where non-antagonistic contradictions are often treated as antagonistic. Minor disagreements about this or that become sources of huge amounts of hostility, transforming non-antagonistic contradictions unnecessarily into points of antagonism. Conversely, political centrists, rightists, and opportunists generally have the opposite problem, where they treat antagonistic contradictions as non-antagonistic, proposing peace where the only solution is force. For example, the antagonistic contradiction between a brutal occupying colonial force and a colonized people is sometimes treated as something that can be resolved peacefully through the ballot box. But, as Frantz Fanon reminds us, decolonization is always a violent event. So, we need to carefully study each particular contradiction to understand whether it's an antagonistic contradiction that can only be resolved by force, or a non-antagonistic contradiction that can be resolved peacefully, and then act accordingly. Now, why does all this matter? Why do we need to understand dialectics, historical materialism, contradiction, and so on? Because, as the big man once said, philosophers have hitherto only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it. And if we want to change the world, then we need to understand it and its laws of motion. Misunderstanding dialectical materialism as the philosophical basis for motion and development, and particularly the law of quantitative change and qualitative transformation, leads people to erroneous views of socio-historical development, specifically reformist incrementalist views focused entirely on quantitative changes rather than on qualitative transformations. For example, pushing the idea that you can just vote in socialism, or somehow reform capitalism all the way to communism without revolution, which is ahistorical and demonstrates an acute misunderstanding of dialectics. And many people who call themselves Marxists make these mistakes all the time. In fact, many of these same people even struggle with basic questions like what is capitalism or what is socialism, which can only be sufficiently answered with a thorough understanding of contradiction. What do I mean by this? Mao teaches us that the nature of a thing is determined mainly by the principal aspect of a contradiction, the aspect which has gained the dominant position. As such, in a given society, when the bourgeoisie is the principal aspect, the nature of that society will be capitalist. However, Mao continues, this situation is not static. The principal and the non-principal aspects of a contradiction transform themselves into each other and the nature of the thing changes accordingly. The dominator will become the dominated and vice versa. And this means that when the proletariat becomes dominant and the bourgeoisie dominated, the nature of the society itself within which this is happening fundamentally changes, putting it on the road to communism. The implications of understanding the principal aspect of a contradiction gives us unique insight into the question of whether or not this or that society is socialist. While there are certainly many specific characteristics of this transition period, it's no longer simply a shallow question of communist aesthetics or sloganeering about the commodity form, but rather a scientific socialist examination of class contradiction that asks, which aspect is dominant. Now, how does a class enforce its dominance? Well, to answer this, we can ask, how does the bourgeoisie maintain its dominant position? To put it bluntly, primarily down the barrel of a gun. Specifically through bourgeois state violence, or the threat of it, largely through its police and military forces. Which is why the police break strikes and repress the workers when we try to unite, and why they facilitate forced evictions. They protect private property and the capitalist class, not the proletariat. And as long as these bourgeois state forces remain in place, unchallenged by a proletariat able to match its strength to defend our own specific class interests, the bourgeoisie will remain dominant in the contradiction and capitalism will prevail. Today we've taken a look at the meaning of contradiction. We've touched on its universality and particularity, the principal contradiction, the principal aspect of contradiction, and the place of antagonism in contradiction. We've also considered why studying all this matters, addressing what can sometimes feel like abstract philosophism by examining the concrete real-world implications of dialectical materialism. As always, these videos are just introductions to much larger subjects. To deepen and fully develop your understanding, you need to struggle with these topics a lot more. So make sure to continue working through the reading about contradiction and dialectical and historical materialism in the description box below. Next up, we'll be looking at utopian socialism and scientific socialism. Thank you to all the supporters on Patreon, I couldn't do this without yous. Thank you Ian McShea, Ugopnik, Matthias Hognes, Annex Magnus, Borku Gorilla, Ryan Hodgson, Soup, Evan Crossland, Madeline, Sonic232, Sagan, Michaela Schmid, Christian Napalis, Brian Roos, Alfonso Dingo Torres, Mekalova, Key to the Fields, Rock Artist, Todd Sprang, Nike Desaid, Train H13, Miosifer, Hunter Johnson, Rare Hero, Donald Quistleva, Six Nivielen, Lepanion, Kale Marks, Roja, Blair Don, Rich Vert, MLM in Practice, Eric Lindahl, ZK Goody, Laverna Wintermore, Kyle Rapp, Vuchko, Michael Stone, Doc Toma, Ayob Farah, Becky, Pastor Schubert, Romuald Bedier, A Mouthwash Bottle.
Factual,
honest news. Not biased, but complete.
You've probably heard people saying things along the lines of, socialism's great in theory, but terrible in practice. That it's a beautiful idea, but ultimately that it's utopian. And that if we want to be realistic, then we have to accept that capitalism is simply the only system that works. Abandon your utopian idealism and embrace a system which requires infinite growth on a planet of finite resources. But beyond the obvious absurdity of capitalists claiming that socialists are the utopian idealists, as though we live in a parallel universe where up is down and down is up, when you start reading Marx and Engels, you hear these socialists calling other socialists utopians. There's no escaping it. The difference, however, is that Marx and Engels actually know what they're talking about. So, what is it they have to say? What is utopian socialism and how does it differ from Marxist scientific socialism? Let's find out. Welcome to Socialism 101, a series designed to help educate people with no prior knowledge on the basics of socialism and communism from an ML and MLM perspective with short and hopefully easily digestible videos. If this sounds interesting to you, then go ahead and hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell below. And if you'd like to support Marxist educational content, then toss in €1 or $1 per month over on Patreon to help keep this going. Now, unless you were born into a Marxist household or something like that, there's a good chance you've probably gone through a stage early on in your political development where you conceived of socialism as a kind of liberalism plus. You may have realised that slogans like liberty, equality and fraternity, upon which modern bourgeois liberal society is supposedly built, appear to only apply to the rich, while the rest of us are forced to toil systematically under constraint, inequality and isolation. And so maybe you've thought, well, in that case, we should look into doing a bit of socialism, because socialism actually can guarantee us all liberty, maximum possible equality and nurture fraternity. The basis for socialism then would be the achievement of these liberal ideals, which capitalism has shown itself incapable of fulfilling. And so maybe you start thinking of alternatives. Maybe you and your mates could band together and open up a worker cooperative. Or to hell with modern corporate society, maybe you could go even further and start up a radical egalitarian commune. And you know, you wouldn't be the first to have these kinds of ideas. In fact, prior to Marxism, these were the kinds of positions that some of the early prominent socialists and communists like Saint-Simon, Fourier and Robert Owen were putting forward. And between them, they got a lot of things right. There were many grains of truth in their analyses which helped us to arrive at modern communist theory. But as human consciousness is historically contingent and determined by social existence, they were of course fundamentally limited by the moments in which they existed. Consequently, their socialism was founded on a utopian idealist basis that saw itself as somehow existing outside of history, and assumed that we can, through rationality and reason, simply conjure up visions of the perfect world based on egalitarian values in our minds and then construct society in accordance with that vision. In a sense, this attempts to impose our ideas onto reality, rather than deriving our analysis from reality. And we can see how this would stem from an early 19th century context of bourgeois liberal revolution as a manifestation of the idealist notion that great men and their ideas are the driving force of history. Marxism, however, as you'll recall from the past 3 videos, opposes this idealist premise. Instead, Marxism begins with a materialist analysis of history, examining the contradictions within societies and what the resolution of these contradictions entails. It bases its analysis on the fundamental interconnectedness of all phenomena, understanding dialectical development and rejecting a metaphysical static notion of some perfect utopian ideal to which reality will have to adjust itself. The basis for socialism for Marxists, then, is not to be found supposedly external to capitalism in the minds of these great utopian socialist thinkers attempting to realise their ideals of liberty, equality and fraternity. For scientific socialists, the basis for socialism is to be found within capitalism itself, its internal contradiction, specifically capitalism's core antagonism between its socialised character of production and its private form of appropriation, manifested in the contradiction between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. Now, under earlier systems, we often saw private production and private appropriation, and we still do see this to a small extent with the petty bourgeoisie. Think small handicraftsmen who produce their own goods, then appropriate all value created by this process for themselves. But under capitalism, we see generally that production is socialised as workers collectively produce huge amounts of surplus value, which is then appropriated privately by capitalists. The whole system is built on this private capitalist appropriation of the proletariat's collective unpaid labour. And this is a hugely antagonistic contradiction wherein if the workers push for better conditions, making any gains, this necessarily comes at a loss to the capitalists. If the proletariat receives more of the surplus value that it produces, then the capitalist necessarily receives less. If the proletariat receives all of the surplus value it produces, then the capitalist can no longer exist. Their existence depends on this unpaid labour of the proletariat. They need us, but we don't need them. And the realisation of this fact pushes the proletariat forward to resolve the contradiction. How is this fundamental contradiction of capitalism between social production and private appropriation resolved? By moving to both social production and social appropriation, where the surplus value generated by proletarian labour power, instead of being appropriated by these capitalist vampires, is appropriated by the proletariat itself. And so we see that the basis for socialism for scientific socialists, for Marxists, lies in the resolution of this very contradiction between social production and private appropriation, between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, between the productive forces and the relations of production. Socialism necessarily emerges from capitalism itself through the resolution of its internal contradictions, not from the minds and ideas of individuals dreaming of a perfect utopian society. So we should now be able to see a distinction emerging between scientific socialism and utopian socialism, where scientific socialists understand that proletarian revolution will usher in socialism as a result of capitalism's internal contradictions. Utopian socialists essentially believe that their good ideas can usher in socialism. That if only the masses knew about the horrors of capitalism and the virtues of their ideas and values, then everyone in the world would certainly willingly embrace communism the very next day. Now, we will dive deeper into the question of where correct ideas come from and the Marxist theory of knowledge based on social practice in a later video. But it should be clear by now already that, despite what some well-known progressive figures of the day might say, Marxism is not just an extension of bourgeois liberalism, and its basis is not simply a more complete realisation of its principles like liberty, equality and fraternity. Scientific socialism is based on the materialist analysis of class contradictions throughout history, the resolutions of which progress society from one stage to the next. In the context of modern society, scientific socialist analysis primarily focuses on capitalism's internal contradiction between socialised production and private appropriation, which provides the material basis for socialism itself, as this antagonism must be resolved. And further, it can only be resolved through socialist revolution, the hero of which is the collective revolutionary proletariat, not the detached bourgeois intellectual who conjures up their perfect egalitarian society in their mind and then attempts to impose that vision upon the world. Revolutions that advance us from one stage of social historical development to the next are not just the result of great men's ideas being imposed on the world, but rather it is the resolution of class contradictions within society that propels us forward to the next epoch. Therefore, the transition from capitalism to socialism too will not be the result of great men constructing society based on their grand visions, but rather the result of the class struggle between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie towards the negation of the negation in classless society. This is the scientific socialist, Marxist basis for socialism, a decisive rupture from earlier utopian socialist projects. Today we've taken a look at utopian socialism and scientific socialism. We've looked at the basis for utopian socialism, tracing its developments out of bourgeois liberal idealism. We then contrasted that with scientific socialism as based on historical materialism and the analysis of class contradictions as being the motor for social historical development, rather than just individuals with lofty ideals. As always, these videos are not a substitute for studying theory in depth, just a supplement, so make sure to continue reading to deepen your understanding of these topics. Make sure to have a read of Socialism, Utopian and Scientific by Friedrich Engels for more. It's quite short and very accessible even for newcomers to theory. Link in the description box below. Next up, the Marxist theory of value. Thank you to the supporters on Patreon, this series wouldn't be possible without yous. Thank you Ian McShay, Ugopnik, Matthias Hognes, Anik Magnus, Borku Gorilla, Ryan Hodgson, Soup, Evan Crossland, Madeline, Sonic232, Sagan, Michaela Schmid, Christian Nepales, Brian Ruse, Alfonso Dingo Torres, Mechalova, Keith the Fields, Rock Artist, Todd Sprang, Nike the Sage, Train H13, Meowsifer, Hunter Johnson, Rare Hero, Don Loquishleva, Sixty Velan, Lepanion, Kale Marks, Roja, Blair Don, Emma Lemon Practice, Eric Lindahl, ZK Goody, Laverna Wintermore, Kyle Rapp, Vuchko, Michael Stone, Doctoma, Iob Farah, Becky, Pastor Schubert, Rumwell Bedier, A Mouthwash Bottle, Mr. Miyamoto, Kyle King, Reverend Lon Gnome Hollywood, Wonderbad, JT Chapman, Jose, Joseph Shepard, Jack Schneidman, Comer Damara, Weltford 99%, Spoop, and Trailer Park Communist. Cheers everyone, August Longafo.
Alright, I think what I'm gonna do is, let's see where we at. How many have we just went through? We're on Marx's Law, value. Okay, we will continue this probably tomorrow. But I think I'm going to call it for streaming tonight. Thank you guys so much for